This is the moment a huge fire came rolling down the foothills of Boulder County in Colorado. The fast-moving blaze engulfed hundreds of homes. Locals say they haven't experienced anything like it.
You know, this is the first time I've really been involved in anything like this, and I'll tell you, it is really scary.
The ditches and things and the trees, they're all up in flames, like there's embers everywhere. So it makes me very frightened, of course, with the wind, that it's going to continue to spread to other homes.
Strong winds and dry conditions are fueling the flames. Officials say some of the fires were sparked by falling power lines, which ignited prairie grasses. A state of emergency has been declared and tens of thousands of people evacuated from the towns of Superior and Louisville. Many are getting stuck in traffic jams as they tried to escape.
Gusts of 100, 110 miles an hour can and have moved this fire down a football field in a matter of seconds. Very little time to get out, very little time to even get the most important parts of your life.
We currently have thousands of individuals in the south part of our county and in the areas of Superior and Louisville who have been evacuated. We know that there are structures, both homes and businesses, that have been burned and lost. I'm speaking about hundreds of structures.
In Boulder County, tens of thousands of people have been left in the dark with power lines down or destroyed. Patients in critical care are being moved out of hospitals because of the threat from smoke. Winds are gradually weakening, giving firefighters some respite, but the billowing smoke could be a bigger hazard as it travels across Colorado.
Tens of thousands of Coloradans are waiting for the smoke to clear to learn what they've lost.
Things look okay from up here, but there is some smoldering in the area, so until you really get down there, it's almost impossible to know.
David Marks, who lives in fire-ravaged Boulder County, knows 3 people who've lost their homes.
Full homes engulfed in flames, so 50, 60 feet high probably. It was really, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, just house after house, fences, just stuff flying through the air, just caught on fire.
Authorities say they believe as many as 500 homes have probably been destroyed as the fire tore through drought-stricken neighborhoods. At least one first responder and several other people were injured as winds of up to 169 kilometers per hour spread intense flames with terrifying speed. Colorado Governor Jared Polis and Boulder County Sheriff Joe Pelley toured the devastation from the air.
This was a disaster in fast motion, all over the course of half a day. Nearly all the damage, many families having minutes to get whatever they could, their pets, their kids, into the car and leave. The last 24 hours have been devastating.
Polis says President Joe Biden promised to free up federal funds with an expedited declaration of a major disaster.
Rescuers continued to work around the clock Monday trying to reach residents still trapped across the northeastern state of Bahia. 72 towns and cities have been flooded by torrential rains that intensified over the Christmas holiday when 2 dams collapsed. In the city of Itabuna, some residents returned to their homes to pick up their belongings through a second-floor window. Emergency workers rescued hundreds in nearby towns, but heavy currents on the swollen rivers continue to complicate the operations.
With this volume of water, it's difficult to maneuver even with jet skis. It has been difficult to reduce the risk for the teams and the victims. Rescue teams had to retreat in certain moments.
The governor of the state of Bahia declared it the worst disaster in the state's history. 500,000 have been affected. At least 16,000 are homeless.
Right now, we are focused on rescuing people and sheltering them. But we are also carrying out technical visits with mayors to identify if it will be necessary to build new houses or repair them, as well as public infrastructure.
Authorities are also monitoring an additional 10 dams for any danger signs and say they will regulate the release of water to avoid flash floods.
We are looking at the forecast for the next few days and the impact it can have and decide which floodgates to open and what volume of water we can release without causing further problems. We need to alleviate areas already flooded without harming others. It's a complex technical decision.
Many have been surprised by the severity of the rain. Authorities blame an increase in the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean mixed with the Niña weather phenomenon for pushing rain patterns north. Some experts say it's a sign of climate change.
This is really the kind of thing we unfortunately expect to happen more and more frequently. According to the last IPCC report, this type of event is already 30% more frequent than in pre-industrial times. So that's pretty much what's happening.
The forecast calls for more rain, but even when that stops, it will take many weeks, if not months, to recover from the devastation.
Much of the neighborhood is still submerged in water as intermittent rain continues. Some people had to rush out of their homes in the middle of the night.
Surpresa, né? O pessoal estava todo dormindo e quando a gente deu por ferro, já tinha invadido a casa. Só deu tempo de sair as pessoas da casa. Felizmente, não tivemos vítimas fatais, né?
Com quase 1,80 m de altura em algumas casas aqui.
About 200 people were rescued by boats across 3 towns. The heavy currents of swollen Cachoeira River made rescue operations more difficult.
Com esse volume de água, ficou difícil, inclusive, a manobrabilidade com os jet skis, para, digamos assim, não oferecer risco àquele que está pilotando, nem à vítima que está sendo socorrida.
Flooding has continued on and off for weeks, causing what the state governor has declared the worst disaster in Bahia's history. Record rains followed a long drought, affecting livelihoods in the state of 15 million inhabitants. The situation worsened over Christmas after a pair of dams gave way, sending residents scrambling for higher ground. Local media say authorities are monitoring an additional 10 dams for any signs they may collapse.
Small arms and automatic gunfire echo across the banks of the Moi River inside Myanmar. A plume of dark smoke rising after an artillery strike. A few hundred meters away on the Thai side, a makeshift shelter for refugees who fled across the river. For the moment, they don't want to move too far away so they can monitor what's happening in their homes. But they can also hear the ferocity of the fighting.
In Myanmar, the situation is very bad. They're using helicopters to drop bombs. We had to run to survive. The children and the adults ran together to the side.
It's not safe to go home because there are planes overhead shooting. We don't feel it's safe to go back.
The border police in Thailand say the fighting broke out at dawn, as it has done for the last few days. The Thai military have returned fire on a number of occasions, just warning shots, they say. Some munitions have fallen on the Thai side. This farmer pointing out damage from shrapnel after several mortars fell in his fields. Those wounded in the crossfire have come across to Thailand for treatment, as have thousands of refugees, a number that's growing every day.
In the last 2 or 3 days there have been serious clashes, with planes attacking the villages, and there have been several wounded people crossing over the border to get treatment.
But Thailand is not keen to encourage people to cross.
This is one of the places where people have been coming across, but the Thai army have put razor wire all across the top of the bank of the river. But for the moment, they're pretty happy to stay over there, ready to come across the border if the fighting gets any closer.
Children play on the riverbank as the evening sets in. But the battles that are raging along the river between Myanmar's military and armed Karen groups shows no sign of letting up or letting them return home. Bags of rice and beans loaded up from a warehouse in the Thai town of Mesot. It's emergency aid desperately needed by people who fled from fighting inside Myanmar. The relief package has been put together by local businessmen who come from Myanmar but live here in Thailand. They're doing it because no one else will.
This is the UNHCR job, and we are just like a small groups, and we are grassroots. We have not many capacity of like funding or the gathering this kind of aids.
But operating in Myanmar is complicated. First, the volunteers have to negotiate with Thai border guards, who are helpful, but whose first priority is security. Then a call to a local contact on the other bank in Myanmar.
Well, they're coming across the river now to get the supplies, and there are boxes of instant noodles, some water and some salt. But with more than 10,000 people displaced inside Myanmar, this is only a very temporary fix. On the Thai side, everyone retreats behind a tape barrier, a nod to COVID-19 protocols. The swimmers then load the precious cargo onto makeshift rafts. The water's shallow, so ferrying it across the river isn't hard, but they can't afford to lose anything. Looks of relief on the opposite bank are not just because of the food. Fighting between government troops and the ethnic Karen fighters has eased over the last 2 days. And the Thai military say they're confident Myanmar's army will step back.
All this time, we've always received good cooperation when it comes to asking them to stop, so that there won't be any threat to the safety of Thais and their property.
The Karen fighters aren't so sure. They've been in conflict with Myanmar's army for decades, and there's little trust.
We don't trust the ceasefire. They've been destroying villages, killing villagers, and leaving only ashes. So how can you trust them? How can you have a ceasefire?
All of that's bad news for more than 5,000 Myanmar refugees on the Thai side. They're now assembled in one camp, and the Thai authorities are installing infrastructure, suggesting an extended stay. That could mean it'll be weeks, if not months, before they can cross these hills and return home.
Filipinos packed malls and shopping districts during the holidays as cases of COVID-19 appeared to be dropping to new lows. The government had eased most restrictions ahead one of the busiest seasons, but experts warned there was no room for complacency.
Starting December 19, we somehow had an alert that there's already like a switch of trend, and the increase in the positivity rate is very, very fast. And in terms of patterns, we see that most of the cases currently are asymptomatic and mild, and they are coming from the 20s, 30s age group. So somehow we can correlate this kind of dynamics to mobility of people because of the holidays.
More Omicron patients had been identified this week by the health department, while a traveler from the United States who tested positive had breached quarantine regulations in order to party. At least a dozen of her close contacts now have the virus.
The Omicron variant is driving COVID-19 cases to record numbers in many countries. The Philippines has largely been spared, but daily infections are on the rise. And while it's possible the new virus variant is spreading, health department officials say it's too early to make that conclusion.
A new wave of the virus is likely not only to strain the country's healthcare system, it could exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in regions still suffering from the impact of Super Typhoon Rai. As it is, there are already outbreaks of diarrhea and gastroenteritis in those areas worst hit by the storm.
We haven't received official report except for increase of cases in diarrhea, cough and cold. But cough and cold are among the symptoms closely monitored for COVID. There are no partition or division in the evacuation center. So COVID is an airborne disease, and such as that, it can easily also spread.
Aid workers hoped an increase in COVID-19 cases would be the last thing they would have to deal with, as they're still struggling to provide basic needs like food and clean drinking water to the millions affected by the typhoon.
Hundreds of Hong Kong police raided the Stand News office in the early hours of Wednesday morning, using a warrant under the much criticised national security law to collect boxes of what were described as journalistic materials. 6 people linked to the independent media outlet were arrested under a separate law on sedition from the British colonial era. By Wednesday afternoon, Stand News announced it was closing after 7 years.
We are not targeting the reporter. We are not targeting the media. We just target the national security law, the offences.
Among those arrested was well-known singer and activist Denise Ho and former politician Margaret Ng, both former Stand News board members. Police turned up at the home of Stand News deputy assignment editor Ronson Chan, officers telling him to stop recording as they arrived. Chan, who is chairman of the Hong Kong Journalists Association, stood by the now disbanded news organisation.
Stan News has been doing professional reporting. There's no doubt about it. The whole world sees it. It doesn't matter what charges have been made. Nothing can change that fact.
The Hong Kong Journalists Association said it was deeply concerned by the arrests and urged the government to respect the media freedoms that are meant to be safeguarded under the city's mini-constitution, the Basic Law. Hong Kong Chief Secretary John Lee shrugged off the criticism, saying journalism cannot be used as a tool against national security.
They are the evil elements that damage press freedom.
China's government in Beijing says the security law in Hong Kong is necessary for stability following political unrest and mass pro-democracy protests. Dozens have been arrested, prosecuted and jailed since China imposed the legislation last year. 6 months ago, the last remaining pro-democracy paper, Apple Daily, was forced to shut down after its assets were frozen and its founder, Jimmy Lai, arrested. The closure of the Apple Daily left Stan News as one of the last pro-democracy outlets in Hong Kong. Now there are questions over whether smaller online outlets can survive the crackdown on media freedoms.
Next, the leaders of Russia and the United States spoke via the telephone on Thursday. During the call, which was requested by Moscow, President Vladimir Putin warned U.S. President Joe Biden that any move to impose sanctions could lead to a rupture of ties. Adding sanctions would be a colossal mistake. The U.S., meanwhile, urged Russia to de-escalate tensions with Ukraine, vowing to respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine. For more on this story, here's Felix Light reporting from Moscow.
To be quite honest, it's a little bit hard to discern sort of the nature of this. Certainly what we've seen from both sides is, a common spectacle in recent weeks of them basically trying to sort of stress the positives of what went on. We've seen Putin or the Russian deputy foreign minister speaking on behalf of Putin, saying that the talks were positive and saying that, there's more progress to be made in January when the two sides meet again in Geneva. So I think the two sides are clearly invested in the idea of that the relationship is good and that it's improving and that there's at least some kind of possibility to make progress in these talks. But I think as well at the same time, it's very important to remember quite how far apart the two positions are. There were sort of two potential sort of timelines going forward that were elaborated by the Biden side, as we understand. There's of course, if Russia decides to attack Ukraine, there will be vicious sanctions. We are led to believe from the U.S. side. If not, then there is the possibility of broader cooperation. But I think this really illustrates quite how far apart the two sides are. There is very little sort of shared common ground on the Ukraine issue. The Russian side stressed that they'd reached some kind of agreement on the US agreeing not to place defensive weapons in Ukraine. The US said that agreement was just a pre-existing policy that was restated last night. So I think despite the sort of friendly noises and the pledges for more cooperation ahead of the next meeting in Switzerland, I think there's still a very, very large political, a very, very large geopolitical gulf between the two sides. And we'll definitely be following this story very, very closely to see how this sort of crisis plays out.
We're not scared of any army on the other side of the border. That's the message from Ukraine's president in his New Year message, one clearly aimed at Russia, and there was more defiance.
Unfortunately, we have not ended the war in the east of our country yet. This is our primary goal. That's why I say not yet, because next year will definitely be better.
According to Ukrainian officials, there are currently around 100,000 Russian troops near the border. Western governments say they're concerned about a full-scale invasion. The fighting in eastern Ukraine between separatists backed by Moscow and the Ukrainian army started in 2014 as huge protests in the capital Kiev led to the pro-Russian government being overthrown. The conflict has killed more than 14,000 people, devastating Ukraine's industrial heartland known as the Donbass and leaving civilians terrified. Earlier this week, the Russian and US presidents had a phone discussion lasting nearly an hour and involving threats on both sides.
President Biden, what did you convey on your call with Vladimir Putin?
I made it clear to President Putin that if he makes any more moves and goes into Ukraine, we will have severe sanctions We will increase our presence in Europe with our NATO allies, and it'll have to be a heavy price to pay for it.
But our president immediately responded that if the West decides, in this or other circumstances, to impose the unprecedented sanctions mentioned, that could lead to a complete breakdown in ties between our countries and cause the most severe damage to relations between Russia and the West.
Russia's worried by what it says is the West's rearming of Ukraine, and it'll be taking part in a series of meetings starting in 10 days' time. It wants legally binding guarantees that any future expansion of the NATO alliance will exclude Ukraine and other former Soviet bloc countries. It's not clear at this stage where any compromise will come from.
COVID travel woes have returned to airports, with the Omicron variant spreading rapidly even among airline staff. Thousands of flights have been cancelled and delayed in the United States alone. At Seattle Airport, passengers found themselves stranded over the Christmas weekend and beyond.
We had to wait for 2 hours outside in 20-degree weather for a taxi that would be willing to take us to one of the only hotels with room availability. And this morning, we got another Uber driver to bring us back to the airport.
The worsening airline staff shortages have prompted Anthony Fauci, the US government's top infectious disease expert, to suggest that a vaccine mandate could be considered for domestic flights. At the same time, health officials are scrambling to come up with ways to minimize the impact on business and movement. The CDC has shortened its recommended isolation time for people who have tested positive from 10 days to 5 days if they don't have symptoms and continue to wear a mask for 5 more days. It also says people who have received a booster shot of a COVID vaccine or are within 6 months of receiving their second dose don't have to quarantine even if they have been exposed to the virus. The CDC says the change is motivated by science based on what they know so far about the Omicron variant. For international travellers entering the United States, tight restrictions remain in place, including a requirement for a negative COVID test result less than 24 hours old.
A holiday gala far away from home. Musicians of the Roraima Orchestra give free concerts to promote themselves. The musicians are mostly Venezuelan migrants trying to make it in Peru. But it's hard, says lead viola player Guillermo González. Although he's a professional musician, the only job he's been able to land, cleaning car tires, has increased injuries to his back. But most Venezuelan migrants are willing to do any job, and most without health care.
I've stopped eating some food to buy pills. One of my colleagues gave me part of his salary, so I managed to pay for 10 appointments. But for the most part, no one gives me a hand.
More than 1.2 million Venezuelans are displaced in Peru. The National Superintendency for Migration says nearly 80% of them don't have health insurance or other benefits. At the Santa Rosa parish on the outskirts of the capital, at least 50 poor Venezuelan families live on handouts.
Most don't have money for food or a stable job, and many have health problems.
The law here says that only migrant children under 5 years old and pregnant women can have free medical care. The rest must have a residence card, but the majority doesn't have one. Jocelyn Rojas says her son Christian will soon turn 6 and lose his free health care. However, she says it doesn't make much of a difference to have a work permit.
My husband has the residency card, but he works in an informal job where he has no benefits. So we are simply up in the air without anything.
Economists here say Venezuelans have contributed to Peru's GDP with 0.2% last year, but the challenges continue to be great.
We're talking about an extraordinary situation for which we have to generate extraordinary norms. We are talking with the authorities to advance the paperwork as the door opener for these rights.
Nearly 30% of Venezuelan migrants are professionals, but 9 out of 10 do not work in their expertise. Among these musicians, there are security guards, cooks, street vendors. Many say they hope they can soon play full-time, but for now, their contribution to Peruvians is music that heals the soul. Mariana.
Elon Musk's reputation has come crashing down to earth in China. On Chinese social media, internet users have lashed out at the businessman, calling for a boycott of Tesla products after China accused his satellites of putting their space station at risk.
年7月和10月，美国太空探索技术公司发射的星链卫星，先后2次，出于安全考虑，中国空间站采取了紧急避碰措施。
Earlier in December, Beijing took the dispute to the UN, accusing the United States of putting its astronauts' lives in danger.
美国口口声声宣称所谓负责任外空行为概念，这是典型的双重标准。
China's space station is a source of national pride for the country. Beijing began launching the first components of the station earlier this year.
3, 2, 1.
Some 1,900 satellites have been put into orbit by SpaceX since 2019. The Starlink program aims to bring internet to the furthest reaches of the planet, providing blanket coverage. But according to researchers at the University of Southampton in the UK, Elon Musk's satellites are involved in some 1,600 close encounters between two orbiting objects every week. If Chinese consumers ever did carry through with their threat to boycott Tesla, they could hit Musk where it hurts most, in his pocket. Roughly a quarter of what Tesla builds gets sold in China.
والله العظيم ألقط حديد ولقط باقة وولادي أطرد بيهم تا يلقطون ويجيبون لهم مشدان تا نبيعن تا نشتري بيه الخبز واشتري لهم بطاطات أو بندورات. والله العظيم هو حالتنا حيل مركوكة.
نشوف أبار هذاك النهار اللي لقينا هنا قنابل 2 في الشق نلقاه من كم نهار زاد طقت في الشقة بس العمال الله ستر كانت بعيدة عنهم بي يعني كثير شغلات بي قزيز الوحدة لما تدخها برجلها ما تقدر تمشي تظل 3 أيام بالبيت إيش بدنا نسوي بدنا نشتغل تا نعيش.
لك اطفال هي شدحيش جاري بحالها يعني انت شلون عايشين هسه عيشه شلون انت عندك طفل تعيشه وشلون العيشه لا عيشه رهافيه شلون العيشه